Hi, welcome to this week's With Liberty and Justice for Some. I'm Congressman Mark Pocan. One of the most controversial things that Donald Trump has been doing since he got elected has been his indiscriminate use of tariffs. They've generated all sorts of nicknames, including Trump's tariff taxes. The thing is, tariffs can be used very effectively. Donald Trump doesn't seem to know that, but when a country like China dumps cheap steel in the United States, it's a great idea to use tariffs to protect workers and the industry. But the on again, off again nature of the tariffs has been chaotic at best. And now Trump seems to want to use tariffs as a way to reopen trade deals, but doesn't quite know how to do that either. He's promised 90 trade deals in 90 days. And so far, he says he has frameworks for only two, the UK and China. And I'm not sure that they would agree with that framework discussion as well. Trade policy is not easy to discuss or digest, and that's why I'm glad to have one of the foremost experts on trade policy in the country with us today, Lori Wallach. Wallach is the director of the Rethink Trade program at the American Economic Liberties Project. She's also a senior advisor to the Citizens Trade Campaign, a native of my home state, Wisconsin. She's worked for over 30 years on trade and related issues, written numerous books, and Lori, you've been a media superstar talking about trade and trade policy. With us today for our one question is the former director of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, Rohit Chopra, the agency that has done so much for consumers in this country, and probably people don't know it exists or what it does. But Rohit, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
So our question for you today is, if you were able to change any one federal law, and you just have the power so you can change, what would that one federal law be and why?
I think I would want to ban the ability for the healthcare system to bankrupt people. Mm-hmm. People think that you fall into financial trouble because you're buying too much stuff. The data show that it's medical illness as one of the top reasons that people's financial lives collapse. Wow. I remember in 2017, I was diagnosed with stage 3 cancer. I had lost my job. You feel that your life is in free fall and you're battling bills and insurance bureaucracy. This just does not seem like the way we should ever run things. Yeah. There really should be strong coverage and the ability to avoid financial collapse when you get sick.
And the fact that we're the only industrialized nation that doesn't have universal health care certainly probably lends to that very problem.
Yeah, and our costs that we undertake in terms of paperwork, bureaucracy, and red tape through our insurance company system is inefficient, and it takes money away from actual care of people.
And to then bankrupt someone for that, how much more awful could it be, right?
Yeah, and during our time at the CFPB, we found a whole cottage industry of medical credit cards, medical loans, and even using buy now, pay later to pay for healthcare. I just don't think that this is a system that is sustainable, and it does not work for people.
Rohit, thank you so much for being with us today for one question.
Thanks again.
Thank you so much for being with us today, Lori.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yeah, well, you really are. I've known you, since I've been in Congress and before, and this is something that you've always been our go-to person for many of us in Congress because of your expertise. So let's just start, first of all, before we get into trade, tell us about Rethink Trade and what should we know about that organization or the broader organization?
So Rethink Trade is a part of the American Economic Liberties Project, and Rethink Trade is basically what it says. It is understanding that trade has many benefits, but the rules that we've been using for our trade policies have really mainly been benefiting the biggest corporations, not family farmers, not most workers, not most of us as consumers. And in fact, we need to refigure out what kind of rules can actually work for people on the planet. And that's our mission. And it is actually a part of what was a bigger organization called Global Trade Watch at Public Citizen, which I ran for 30 years. And we spun that one out and joined the leading anti-monopoly corporate power accountability group because I wanted to focus just exclusively on how we fix the problem after 30 years of describing the problem.
So that's great for context. Thanks, Lori. And that's another 30,000 foot. Why does trade matter to people? Because, I think it is a confusing subject given all the mis and disinformation that's out there.
So trade very directly shapes what jobs are available in any country's economy. It doesn't control the total number of jobs. That has more to do with the policy around the value of the dollar and interest rates. But trade, for instance, is perhaps one of the biggest deciders about whether they're quality jobs at living wages for the 64% of Americans who don't have a college degree who are in the workforce, who are smart, hardworking people who can make things that we all need in this country, but who have gotten the short end of the stick under the existing trade rules. And if you get the rules wrong, as we have for many, many decades, you destroy the opportunity both for people to have decent jobs making the things we need, but you also undermine our national resilience and security. So we all learned the hard way during COVID. Here we are in this huge, wealthy, continental-sized country that can do anything. But we couldn't get the basic things we needed. We didn't make them anymore, and we didn't have really very diverse imports. When China got sick and went down, that was kind of the end of it. When Italy went down, we had new antibiotics. We have sole sourcing, hyper-globalization, and it's really not helped us as workers or as consumers.
Tell us a little bit about three of the biggest past trade deals out there, and I'll ask you about them individually, but NAFTA, CAFTA, and the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which I think Trump took us out of back in 2017. Just tell us a little bit, very basically, about each. So tell us about NAFTA.
Well, let me step back and say, what has basically happened for a lot of people to understand the mess we're in is we had a system of trade set up after World War II under a thing called the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And that was working pretty well for the first couple of decades. But starting in 1975, for reasons we can discuss, we fell into a trade deficit and we've never gotten out of it. Now, you add the agreements, two of which went into effect, NAFTA and CAFTA, but I want to throw in there the agreement that put China into the World Trade Organization. After those three agreements passed, which was between 1995, they went into effect in 2000, we saw a dramatic increase in our trade deficit. And if you can imagine, we have lost 90,000 manufacturing facilities in America since 2000, 90,000 in 25 years, devastating. And we know this because all over, in my hometown of Wausau, Wisconsin, in your hometown, all over Kenosha, Beloit, Milwaukee, everywhere, Janesville, we've just seen devastation. And it's not just the Midwest, ironically. We've basically seen the ability to make things, our manufacturing capacity, just destroyed. And that, Mark, is a prediction of trade theory. If you have a chronic large trade deficit, you get deindustrialized and you get income inequality. This is not a surprise, and it can be fixed, but it's what we've suffered.
And NAFTA is kind of the big one I think that most people point to is, what started the decline. Can you just tell us a little bit about what that was and why that gets often referenced?
So NAFTA was a really radical corporate plot, if you will, in that trade agreements used to just cover the cross-border charges, tariffs, on goods. A trade agreement didn't cover something unless you could literally drop it on your foot, only concrete products. NAFTA exploded those boundaries, and it literally set up, for instance, special foreign investor privileges that made it cheaper and easier to offshore jobs to Mexico, where wages were 1/15 of the United States wage. Hardworking folks in Mexico in a modern U.S. auto plant, because within a matter of not many years, we lost 1 million, government certified 1 million jobs lost to Mexico under NAFTA. because whole US factories just picked up and moved, because instead of having a union workforce making a living wage and having benefits, they could pay people literally $5 a day and dump their pollution on the ground, poisoning the local community, and make really unjust but enormous profits. And that race to the bottom was unique with Mexico because, one, it had those crazy investor incentives to offshore. It wasn't just that it was less expensive to make it there. They made it actually an incentive in the agreement. And the agreement had no floor of decency. There was no labor rights, no wages, no environmental protections. So it literally set off a race to the bottom. And there had never been a trade agreement that zeroed out all tariffs between the countries of such a differential between the standard of living in the US versus in Mexico. And so we got a race to the bottom, just as the unions and the members of Congress, most Democrats who opposed that agreement, said would happen.
Yeah. So at that time, and I wasn't in Congress, obviously, what was the discussion when they had these incentives that literally it encouraged people to offshore or send out of the United States good manufacturing jobs?
So at the time, people were used to trade agreements like the GATT that were just about tariffs. And so few people read the trade agreements. So as a recovering trade attorney, I was running around to members of Congress with my mentor, Ralph Nader, who could, see all these members. And I remember just this horrible, I knew we were going to lose moment where we're sitting with Senator Ted Kennedy, champion of labor and working people. And Senator Kennedy said, "Are you protectionist? You're against free trade? We're for trade. Trade's good for working people." And Ralph Nader said, "Sir, look at this chapter. Lori, read this out loud. This is an incentive to kill union jobs, and it takes away all the risks of going to Mexico so that you can relocate and make these scandalous profits on the backs of people there and here." And Senator Kennedy said, "That can't be true. That can't be in a trade agreement. That's not what's in trade agreements." So about 5 years after NAFTA, the few Democrats who voted for it started saying it was the worst vote they had ever made. So many members, former Speaker Nancy Pelosi voted for NAFTA. She believed in what President Clinton said it would do and just couldn't imagine that these things we were showing her, there were rules in there that let Big Pharma raise medicine prices. What the heck is that doing in a free trade agreement? Corporate protectionism, longer monopolies in patents so they can charge more money. NAFTA woke everyone up, though. It was a new model. It was a horrific model. No one could imagine that what it really was. And then after they saw the results, the whole debate shifted.
So did it shift in time for CAFTA then? And how was that different?
So CAFTA was NAFTA for a bunch of Central American countries. And the sad truth of that is, and by the way, with NAFTA, even despite the disbelief that a trade agreement could have all this rotten stuff in it, it also, just to give you a sense, the whole thing is sort of, a ptomaine sandwich on, a pneumonia bun spread with maggots. The whole thing, every piece of it was like, ugh. There was a ban on Buy America procurement in NAFTA. There had never been procurement rules, but literally a ban on how we can spend our tax dollars. And the state of Wisconsin, among 36 other states, got sucked into signing up for that for some state procurement, which is, I think, how you and I first crossed paths, because there were a few very smart state legislators, you and I think at that point, Assemblyman or Senator Edelman, who were looking at this going, wait 1 second. But a majority in Congress passed it. When it came to CAFTA, it passed it narrowly. Almost all the Democrats were against. When it came to CAFTA, what ended up happening is actually there was a majority against. And they held the vote open for 2 hours, and they drugged people back from their offices, and they got 2 Republicans to flip. It passed by 1 vote. And the 2 guys who flipped lost their seats in the next election.
Wow.
And that was one of the last major trade agreements that ever passed, because, for instance, the Trans-Pacific Partnership you mentioned, that was the same model, but by then enough members of Congress had seen the results, and they could never get within 50 House votes of a majority on TPP. So that one, Donald Trump likes to say, I killed TPP. Baloney.
Prior, yes.
Like TPP had been sitting out there in the sun, finished, moldering for 8 months before he showed up in town. And it was basically, he got to put the casket in the ground and dance on it. But he was not the cause of death. That was the US Congress and frankly, people across the country. Because folks, this is our lives that this affects. People went to their members of Congress district by district and said not in my name. If you're for this, you're not for me. And that actually made all the difference, Mark. There was never a majority to pass TPP, and thank God we escaped it.
Well, and that's where you and I and Rosa DeLauro and many of the unions and many other advocates and many other members of Congress were kind of, working strong to make sure. Yeah. Other than we had a U.S. trade rep that maybe wasn't the best to deal with at the time. I'll leave it at that. Okay.
Well, so just to add one thing, folks, if you can imagine what NAFTA did with Mexico, the TPP had Vietnam, which had much lower wages than Mexico and an autocratic government that literally bans independent unions. It had Malaysia. It had a lot of countries that have major industrial capacity, but built on what are called mercantilist or beggar thy neighbor rules, where the government suppresses wages as a strategy to try and make revenue for the government and for the elites. They subsidize up the yin-yang, all the production. They manipulate currency levels. And they basically set up a system so that you're overproducing only for export, people living there on the short end of the stick. But the Communist Party of Vietnam actually makes a lot of money to focus on the military, et cetera. Not a system where we would have, if we thought NAFTA was bad, TPP would have been NAFTA on steroids.
Yeah. And so in many ways, we're still paying the price, right, of those, especially NAFTA, those initial trade deals. I think almost every small community in my district, when I go to Plain, Wisconsin, there's the factory outside where 150 or 200 people used to work at, but it's been gone for decades now. And what they have left is, either agriculture as a business, which is tough, or home-based businesses. And, they don't even have broadband sometimes, and that's become a problem. So let's just move a little forward, because I just wanted to put that out there so people understood kind of the background about trade and the difficulty are out there. So right now, Donald Trump loves tariffs. And I personally think he loves them for a couple reasons. One, I think he's counting on some artificial revenue for his tax cut bill. But he also really loves tariffs. So can you explain or try to explain what Trump thinks he's doing with tariffs right now?
May I take one more step back to say what he thinks he's trying to fix?
Okay.
Because here's the thing. What he thinks he's trying to fix is a problem for real. That's one of the contradictory things he hopes the tariffs will do. And I just want to say where we've ended up. It's not just that these trade agreements have promoted offshoring, but at this point, as I said, from 1975, we've never had a year of our trade of our exports being bigger than our imports. So we have an ever expanding deficit. It's now $1 trillion. $1 trillion. And so what this now in the world looks like, interestingly, is you have China first and foremost using all of those, what I call beggar thy neighbor mercantilist policies. So all the stuff that's kind of unfair practices. But there are literally 15 countries that have major surpluses because of this kind of stuff with the whole world. And it's a short list. China is the biggest by far, but also it is Taiwan, it is Korea, it is Japan, some European countries, Germany, notorious, a big problem within the European Union, but also on the global stage, the Netherlands, Ireland, because they're rigging tax policies for pharmaceuticals. It's a handful of countries that are basically the cause of the deficits that are now, we're the biggest, 1 trillion. But here's a shocker. There are 67 countries in the world that have chronic trade deficits with the world, and they are big honking countries that you would think are on the way up. It is India. It is Mexico. It is Brazil. they have to have tariffs up against China because their industries are getting flattened. And then the rest of the countries are more or less in balance. So I just want to say there is a huge imbalance. And when President Biden was doing his industrial policies, where tariffs were one of the tools, he got the highest rate of investment in manufacturing in the United States in 30 years because he used tariffs just to keep out those cheating imports. And then he also, and you in Congress did a great job, passed laws that helped incentivize the purchase of domestic made solar and EVs, that helped the investors want to have greenfield new manufacturing facilities set up. It was a complete package. But with that kind of imbalance, if you don't have the complete package, the tariffs alone ain't going to cut it. So what Trump theoretically thinks the tariffs will do, and it's wrong, is if you just ixnay the imports, somehow that is going to be enough. But actually, when you have that level of imbalance, you actually have to do the domestic investment and the domestic procurement policies and the domestic tax policies. We can get ourselves back together and be able to produce more. But the tariffs only approach, and certainly his chaotic on again, off again. Like if I'm an investor, I'm not like lining up to like bring my money bags to the US. I'm on the sidelines with a barf bag. It's like a roller coaster.
Yes. Yeah. So, I mean, and thanks for saying all that, because that's what people need to understand is you can't use a hammer as the only tool in your toolbox, right? And essentially that's what Donald Trump is doing. It can be a very effective tool with a nail, but maybe not as effective of a tool with a screw, and, you know, or many other things that he's doing with it. And so part of it is, even the formula he used didn't seem to make a lot of sense when he put out tariffs to countries, including, I think, one that only had penguins. There are no people. But two, it is that chaotic nature that, you know, if you really want to bring people back to invest, but the tariffs change all the time and you're not sure if he's going to cave because he caves all the time, you're not going to invest that kind of money into making things here, right?
So, you know, so much of what he does is performative, is not thought out. And so let's just assume part of what he really wants to do, let's just assume, because he's been saying it for 30 years, it's the only thing he's been consistent on. He's changed positions and everything else in his life. The one thing he's been consistent on is he wants manufacturing in this country and he hates trade deficits. So if you really want to do that, yes, tariffs are a part of it. But, you know, there are four things one should never do with a tariff if you're trying to rebuild an industrial base. Number one, do not tariff the countries with which you have trade surpluses. We have a trade surplus with Canada. If you take out raw natural crude oil, we have a big trade surplus. We should not be nailing Canada, with whom we sell more stuff than we import from them, and a bunch of other countries where it is just, what? That's not good. Number two, you don't tariff everything at a high rate all the time right away. And the reason that is let's just say, let's talk about the new tariffs they're going to do on medicines. Here's how you should do it. You figure out, what do we have some domestic capacity to make, and what could we make in the next year if we do the rest of the policies with the investments, with the procurement? I mean, we've got a huge demand base. If we made TRICARE, the military medical system, and the VA and Medicare and Medicaid prioritize, get a preference for buying American drugs, we create a real demand. We could have a whole industrial policy. You do that first for a year. You say in advance, on X date, we're going to have 20% tariffs on finished medicines in these categories, the ones we could stand up. You don't put the tariffs on what are called the active pharmaceutical ingredients, the inputs, the chemicals, because if you're trying to start the manufacturing, you have to have the inputs. Meanwhile, you have said on that first day, when you said in 1 year, tariffs on this stuff, you say, and in 18 months, there will be a 15% tariff on the following active pharmaceutical ingredients. And here is money, low interest loans, loan guarantees. We can make this stuff. We used to make this stuff. Let us get our act together so that, like, by year two, you can start to raise the tariffs and you can target which countries are the ones that are the problem. Basically, at this point, we're 90% relied on generic medicines from India for all categories, analgesics, diuretics, like all the most basic stuff. But here's the thing, 90% of those medicines in India are made from chemicals from China. So we've got two problems, and we have to then have slowly building up the tariff levels with the other stuff. Instead, they're probably going to put like 30% tariffs on all imported medicines in like a month. And then what's that going to do? It's going to raise prices and we're not going to have a supply. Right. Those are the things you don't do. And then the final one is obviously you don't put tariffs on, put tariffs off, put tariffs sideways because no one can invest. So they've basically done everything wrong that you could. It's like literally in the book of like, hello, line drawing, things not to do with tariffs is what they have done.
And I don't know about you, but I'm worried that, because of this, people are starting to forget that you can use tariffs wisely. And I've heard some comments from elected officials that show me some damage has been done.
It just makes me want to cry because the combination of everything else about Trump that is upsetting, that makes people reactive to Trump. Unless you love him, you hate him, like no one's neutral. Mm-hmm. So everyone who is reactive to him already has an inclination to be the opposite of whatever he says. And then because there's been such tariff malpractice, people are forgetting that actually the Biden administration just a year ago had us the highest rate of new factory construction in 30 years, in part because Biden raised tariffs higher than what Trump had for EVs and for solar. And he did it in a targeted, strategic way, and he did it thinking it through. I mean, you mentioned the Penguin Islands. Yeah. Okay, here's what's even worse than the fact that people think they tariffed Penguin Islands. Those Penguin Islands are not a country. Those are within the customs territory of Australia. Their list of countries to which they applied tariffs included 10 things that are not countries that don't exist. This is how incompetent it is. So like everyone rest assured, penguins are fine because actually the Heard and McDonald Islands are not a country. That is like a set of rocks in the Antarctic that for colonial reasons are under Australia and they don't have their own customs union. Meanwhile, of all countries, Greenland was not listed. Greenland, though it is related to Denmark, is its own customs territory with its own schedule. So you actually needed to list Greenland versus all these, like they listed all these ridiculous islands that are, some of them are like Caribbean islands are literally states of France. It would be like listing Illinois in an international list of things. So they just, another of the lessons is know your damn work and do not just make stupid mistakes. But the reason that this is, I think, being so toxic is because they have done such a poor job of it that a lot of Democrats and progressives are forgetting, why is this stuff so cheap that you need tariffs against it? It's because it's forced labor. It's because it's made with dumping toxics on the ground. It's because it's made suppressing wages. When you have those conditions that would wipe out fair trade, not just our domestic stuff, but stuff made under standards we would be happy to buy in other countries. When you have countries that are abusing to get this low price based on misery and pollution, then of course you want to, it's called countervail that bad conduct so that the higher road way of making things here and in other countries has a market. You don't want to let the bad behavior win out, and people are forgetting that is the right use of tariffs. And we've done that traditionally. We would not have a steel industry here at all if we hadn't done that. We would be flooded with products made by forced labor, by Chinese Uyghur concentration camp victims if we didn't do that. And people are forgetting that.
Yeah. So what is he getting right? What should we give him credit for right now?
So what they're getting right is the sectors. So let me step back again. There are different, not all tariffs are created equal. So there are different authorities under which a president can enact tariffs. One thing to know, which Mark knows, the U.S. Constitution gives Congress exclusive authority over tariffs. Article 1A of the Constitution, the right to lay duties, lay and collect duties. Duties is another word for tariff. And also the right to regulate foreign commerce between nations. So there are actually two clauses in that part of the Constitution that make it clear that the body closest to the people, Congress, not the king, the president, gets control over trade. And, that comes out of the fact that we were hatched in a trade war. The Boston Tea Party was a fight over the king smacking us with big T tariffs to finance his, wars in Europe without any say. And suddenly we have these crazy tariffs. So Congress has delegated through different statutes the ability for a president to use tariffs. So first, what he's doing right is that there is a statute that is, they just call them by their numbers. So you hear it on radio and TV is 232 tariffs. And that stands for Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962. And that is a law that basically allows a president, Congress said, all right, president, you have this tariff authority. If you can show that there is a threat to our national security, then you can put up tariffs to try and counter that. And that authority requires a study, and you have to prove the case. And that authority applies to all countries for whatever sector. So that's the one for steel and aluminum. That's smart. We need that. No steel and aluminum, no infrastructure, we're toast. That's the one that they're starting to do for copper. We should do that because with no copper, no electricity, no electrical conductivity. That's the one for autos. And we should do that because that's a sector there's overproduction and a lot of cheating. And we can't be a continental sized country with no auto sector. That's the one they're going to do for meds. And they're right. It is a national security issue, but they're likely to mess up how they implement it. So far, the steel and the autos have been done decently. They've been a little worrisome and sort of trading away some of the details of it, but it's been not bad. They also have listed some other sectors like microchips, totally makes sense. They have also listed some other sort of essential materials like critical minerals, totally makes sense. So those kind of tariff authorities where you have to actually prove your case and there are rules about what can, be allowed.
Yeah.
That is right. They're not implementing it great, but that is useful. Another thing that they're doing that is right is, in the first term, they put up tariffs on China using another of those statutes you hear, Section 301. And that one refers to Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974. And that's just another of these things where Congress said, all right, Mr. President, here's another way you can use tariffs. That one, you have to do a big honking detailed study that basically shows a particular country is cheating systematically. You have to prove it. And then once you get that decision about that country, then you can put up tariffs across the board on whatever goods you want to in that country. So 232 is a sector, as many countries as you think is necessary. 301 is the countries misbehaving. So there are 301 tariffs on China, which then Biden increased, which then they started to increase in a strategic way and then went crazy. And Trump went all the way up to a basically embargo level, no trade, 145%. That is a tool they should use. But like right now, best I can tell, it's again, the lack of forethought, the lack of planning. They look like they're caving on the China dynamic because they realize like, we actually need the critical minerals China makes. So instead of like setting up our own processing, or there are other countries, Brazil, Australia, where you can get this stuff, instead of setting it up, he just like, oh, let's do tariffs. Oh, let's think about it later. And then all of a sudden we've had to look weak in front of China backing down. Those two mechanisms for using tariffs are kosher, they're strategic. There's another one I think they're going to use if the courts rule against their current system, and that's what's called Section 122. And that allows across the board tariffs up to 15% for up to 150 days if you're having a trade balance or what's called a balance of payments crisis, which is related. So when we buy all those imports, we send out dollars, we're paying in dollars. And then the countries that have the dollars then want to come back into our country and invest. You can end up screwing up your currency level. So our dollar is way higher than it should be to actually be reasonable to represent how we should be for balanced trade. And that's because all these other countries have all of our gazillions of dollars because we're buying all their imports. So he could claim under that statute in a totally legitimate way, given the actual economic statistics, that we've triggered that condition Congress set forward, and you could use tariffs there. That's what I think they're going to do. So, there are tools. Now, I just want to underscore what you said. You can't build a whole house with just a hammer and nails. You need saws, you need screws, you need electricity. And the thing is, right now, best I can tell, they're not actually doing the other part of the policies, the investment, the procurement, and worse, they're killing it. They're trying to zero out like the Inflation Reduction Act money that actually got the boom in manufacturing.
This is complicated, but you do have a great way of explaining it, Lori. I appreciate that. And there's so much more. I mean, trade is something you could do in a lot more than a limited amount of time, but this has been helpful for people to understand. And I think it's fair to say there are some things that he's doing right. And what I don't want to come out of this is people thinking using tariffs are always bad, because there are ways to use them effectively, as you discussed and outlined. Anything else before we wrap up that's important that you think is either not understood or you'd like to make sure people understand about trade?
One other really big thing is tariffs don't always raise consumer prices. So, Congressman Pocan is exactly right that the tariff as a tool is an incredibly important one we need to keep in our national toolbox. But there are people like those folks in the big multinational corporations that would be very happy to pay people a pittance in Vietnam or bust the unions in Mexico, who are using this opportunity of Trump's tariff malpractice to try and basically make every single tariff make the word tariff like the word cancer. There is no good word of cancer. Cancer is always bad. They want to make tariff like that. And that is super dangerous. And what they're saying is a tariff is a tax on the American people. No. A tariff is a charge that a company that chooses to import has to pay. And there are background tariffs that have always been in place. These are special additional trade cheating tariffs that we're talking about. And if a company doesn't want to pay a tariff, then they can source it in a country that doesn't have tariffs. So one thing people don't know is all of the goods that meet the rules of the NAFTA replacement, the USMCA, those are duty-free still.
Yeah.
Most people don't realize we do have duty-free, tariff-free access for goods that meet the rules of the USMCA, the NAFTA 2.0. So you could get it from Mexico, get it from Canada right now, duty-free, different supply chain. Or you can get it domestically, and if it doesn't exist, you can figure out how to actually start making more stuff here. But if you're going to import, then there's a question about whether you pass the cost through. Most people don't realize, but the tariff is charged on the wholesale price. And we as consumers say, go to the store, go to Foot Locker, go to the local, there's a great place in, is it Black Earth, that wonderful shoe place?
Yeah.
So you go there and you buy a set of sneakers. There it's not going to be so bad. So let's go back to Foot Locker, $120 for those Nikes. Okay. The shoe comes in for between $20 and $25. The wholesale price, let's just say the tariff is 25%. Let's make it a $20 shoe so the math is easy. So the $20 shoe comes in, 25% tariff. Oops, that's $5 more. Yeah. Right, you now have a $25 wholesale cost, but Foot Locker is still going to charge you $125. Now there's some other costs. You have to transport it. You have to pay the clerks, whatever. But the reality is there's a huge honking profit margin in there.
Yeah.
So what most people don't realize is during the first Trump tariffs on China, where he had 20% tariffs on $350 billion of Chinese imports, almost half, the actual tariff costs were just absorbed into the profit margin. There's a very famous government study of what happened with prices. And folks who remember inflation was flat until COVID, and inflation was not an issue. Prices weren't going up. The tariffs were huge, though. Why was that? Because the retailers said, I'll just eat the tariff. I've got this much money I'm making anyway. So one of the big problems is people have gotten crazy thinking that what is actually corporate price gouging, where like you and I are thinking like, tariff, and they keep hearing, everyone keeps hearing on the news, oh my God, we're going to have higher prices. So everyone's psyched out like, oh,
and they're taking advantage of this.
So all these companies are taking advantage of it. And I just want to close with this example. Who didn't hear the example, which is being used to this very day by the people who hate all tariffs, who'd be happy to import forced labor goods? Who did not hear the story of Trump's tariffs increased the prices of washers and dryers? We all heard that. Here's what everyone should know. There were no dang tariffs on dryers.
Yeah.
That was actually everyone being psyched out about. We heard there are tariffs on some white goods, which is, what you call refrigerators, washers, dryers, stoves.
Yeah.
Oh my God, there must be tariffs and everything. All of a sudden, the retailers raised prices on dryers, even though there were no tariffs. And they raised prices on washing machines in Canada where there were no tariffs. Because the advertising in the US was going, and the news was going to Canada, and everyone got psyched out about prices are going to go up. In fact, the actual charge on the wholesale price of the washing machine was so minuscule that even if they passed it through to the consumer, you would not have noticed. Instead, they price gouged and they increased the price enormously on the washers. They increased on the dryers that had no tariffs. And they made us all think it was because of tariffs. So one of the things we really need to do, and there's some members of Congress who are working on bills, is basically stop the tariff-related price gouging so we can use the tariff tool without getting screwed as workers and consumers.
Yeah, and we don't want to lose the effective ability to still use tariffs. You're right. So contact information, how do people follow your organization and follow yourself?
So if you want to have what I attempt, although I know it's so hard to unpack, the live action play on this, is me on Twitter, on X, which is Wallach, WALLACH _Lori. And I try and unpack it. I do sort of long threads that try and translate what's going on out of trade jargon. I also please recommend you go to our website, which is www.rethinktrade.org, www.rethinktrade.org. There you will find a lot of the information I just described, including there's some slideshows that sort of walk you through Tariffs 101. So some of this stuff is super complicated. Even if as a trade wonk, I have to think about it endlessly. So if some of this is not sinking in, go to our website. We have fact sheets also. However, if you're a visual learner, we got you. There are videos there if you want to have another video that just sort of boot camp what's a tariff. And then you can sign up there for action alerts. So if you want to get involved, because there's good stuff to do, please join us. And thank you so much for including me.
Yeah, no, thank you, Lori. I mean, like I said, I consider you the foremost expert that I go to if I have questions on trade. So I want other people to hear from you as well. So thanks so much.
Thank you.